Imagine you are the lead engineer on a massive multi-billion-dollar suspension bridge project.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So the politicians and the visionary architects, they get all the headlines.
Oh, for sure. They do the ribbon cutting.
Exactly. They stand at the podium. They unveil these beautiful, pristine blueprints. They pass the zoning laws, and the crowd just goes wild.
Meanwhile, you're the one in the hard hat.
Yes. You are the one who actually has to figure out how to, pour the concrete base underwater while the tide is actively moving.
Yeah, that's the real work.
Yeah.
Because a blueprint is, it's just a promise on paper, really.
Right. You're deciding which specific grade of steel can withstand the wind shear, without buckling over the next 50 years.
The daily decisions made in the dirt. That is the proof of the engineering.
And if you are sitting in a corporate leadership chair right now, that is exactly the brutal reality you are facing with artificial intelligence.
It really is.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are focusing on a massive shift in the tech landscape. We're moving past the theoretical, philosophical debates about AI and looking at what actually happens when organizations are forced to implement sweeping new rules on the ground.
Yeah, the rubber is finally meeting the road.
Exactly. And to help us navigate this, we are featuring insights from a special guest, Nike Diedrich, senior consultant in AI governance and responsible AI, and enterprise AI governance working group lead in Germany.
It's honestly the perfect time to be having this conversation with you all. Because, writing AI regulation, that's merely the starting line.
Barely even the start, yeah.
Right. The real existential challenge for any organization right now is entirely internal. They have to convert these massive, dense legal requirements into tangible governance structures, daily operating models, and, actual human decisions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you look at the current global AI landscape, you are seeing these massive regulatory frameworks finally rolling out.
Everywhere. It's a global shift.
Yeah. We have the EU AI Act, which takes a very strict risk-based approach for those who haven't read all several hundred pages.
This is most people, let's be honest.
Right, thankfully. But it basically categorizes AI systems into tiers. So you have minimal risk things like spam filters all the way up to high-risk systems.
Like AI used in hiring or medical devices, right?
Exactly, or critical infrastructure. It even flat out prohibits unacceptable risks, meaning you legally cannot use AI for social scoring or emotion recognition in the workplace.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive. And then across the Atlantic, you have the U.S. taking a slightly different path with the NIST AI risk management framework.
Right, the NIST framework.
Yeah, which offers comprehensive, voluntary guidelines for mapping and measuring AI risks. So the blueprints, like we said earlier, they're out there.
They are, and they're incredibly detailed. But, handing an executive the EU AI Act or the NIST framework is... it's like handing someone a physics textbook and expecting them to build an airplane.
Good luck with that.
Right. That document does not tell a mid-level product manager how to document a dataset change on a random Tuesday afternoon.
No, it definitely doesn't.
And it doesn't tell a software engineer who actually holds the ultimate liability if, their machine learning model's output starts drifting after 6 months in production. The law tells you the destination. It does not provide the vehicle.
Which brings up a fairly obvious question. I think a lot of people listening might be wondering, well, if the rules are clearly written in the law, why is it so incredibly hard to just follow them?
It seems simple on paper.
Right. Why can't a company just hand the AI Act to their compliance department, tell them to make a checklist and say, make sure we do this? Let's hear Nike explain what happens when organizations move from regulation to implementation.
That's a really interesting question. Because I think many people assume the difficult part is writing the regulation. I'd actually argue it's the opposite. Once the regulation is published, the real work begins. That's the moment organizations have to ask themselves, how do we translate legal requirements into everyday business decisions? That's why I see many organizations today. Most of them are no longer struggling to understand what the AI Act requires. The bigger challenge is turning those requirements into operating models, governance structures, and repeatable processes that people can actually work with. One observation that has really stood out to me across projects is that AI governance is still often treated as the final checkpoint. A business team develops an AI use case, technology builds it, and shortly before deployment, someone says, Let's ask legal, risk, and compliance for approval. At that point, governance inescapably becomes the bottleneck. Not because governance slows innovation, but because it enters the process far too late. The organizations that make the fastest progress take a very different approach. They integrate governance from the beginning. They define ownership early. They clarify which data is being used, how the use case is classified, what documentation will eventually be needed, and who is accountable for which decision. That doesn't create more bureaucracy. It actually removes uncertainty later in the process. And I think this is where the discussion is evolving. I'd say AI governance is gradually moving beyond compliance. It's becoming an operational capability that enables organizations to implement AI repeatedly, consistently, and at scale. At least that's what I'm starting to observe. Let me put it this way. I often compare this to cybersecurity. 20 years ago, cybersecurity was widely seen as a technical control that slowed projects down. Today, no one would seriously argue that a company can scale digital business without strong cybersecurity. I believe AI governance is following a very similar trajectory. For me, the question is no longer whether organizations need AI governance. The real question is whether they can scale AI without it. Every new AI use case doesn't just introduce another model. It also introduces new data flows, new decisions, new accountability, and new operational risk. So, if you think about it, organizations don't just scale AI, they scale complexity. That's exactly why governance becomes a business capability rather than a compliance exercise.
What's fascinating here is the stark distinction being made between governance as a late-stage checkpoint, which is, how most companies handle compliance and governance, as an embedded early-stage organizational capability.
Yeah, those are two very different approaches.
Completely different. If we look back at the evolution of digital business, the comparison to cybersecurity 20 years ago is incredibly apt here.
Oh, that's an interesting parallel.
Back then, security was something you basically bolted on at the very end of a software project. It was viewed purely as a technical afterthought.
Wait, let me push back on that cybersecurity comparison for a second. Because 20 years ago, the security department was universally known as the Department of No.
Yes, they absolutely were.
Right. You would spend 9 months building this amazing fast application, and then right before launch, security would swoop in, audit the code, find 50 vulnerabilities, and basically delay your launch by a quarter.
And everyone hated it.
Exactly. Are you saying we're about to repeat that exact same bottleneck with AI? Because business leaders will absolutely revolt if AI governance just means adding 6 months of friction to every product launch.
Well, that is exactly the danger if companies treat AI governance like old-school cybersecurity. But look at how modern cybersecurity operates today.
Okay, fair point.
You cannot scale a modern digital business without security being foundational, what we call DevSecOps, right? Where security is built into the architecture and the daily workflows from day one.
It's automated now. It's embedded.
Exactly. And scaling AI means scaling complexity on a level we really haven't seen before. When you deploy a new AI use case, you aren't just adding a static piece of code.
Right. It's learning. It's changing.
Yes, you are introducing entirely new dynamic data flows. You're introducing new operational risks that change as the model learns, and completely new accountability structures. If you don't have governance built into the very fabric of how you build things, that complexity will simply crush your deployment pipeline.
So, treating governance as a final checklist right before deployment inevitably turns it into a dreaded bottleneck. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
But let's pivot to something most companies actually already have in place right now, which is AI principles.
Oh, yes, the principles.
Right. If you look at the OECD's AI principles, things like inclusive growth, fairness, transparency, and human oversight, Almost every major Fortune 500 corporation has adopted some version of these.
They look fantastic on a corporate website.
They really do. They have nice graphic and everything, but translating abstract concepts like fairness into operational decisions on the ground, that has to be brutally hard.
Here's Nike on why translating AI principles into operational governance is harder than many organizations expect.
I'd say this is where many organizations underestimate the challenge. Defining AI principles is relatively easy. Almost every organization agrees on concepts like fairness, transparency, accountability, or human oversight. They're important, but they are also very abstract. The real challenge begins when those principles have to guide hundreds of operational decisions across different business units. And that's where things become much more practical. Suddenly, the conversation shifts to questions like who decides whether a use case is high risk? Who owns the documentation? Which data sources are actually approved? Who's responsible when an AI model changes over time? And perhaps most importantly, who makes the final decision when business objectives, technical possibilities, and regulatory expectations don't perfectly align? That's the point where principles have to become governance. In my experience, organizations don't struggle because they lack good intentions. They struggle because principles don't automatically create operating models. You need a clear ownership, defined decision processes, common documentation standards, and governance that fits naturally into existing business processes. Otherwise, every project starts from scratch. Every team interprets the principles differently, and governance becomes inconsistent. This is also why I believe AI governance shouldn't be viewed as an isolated compliance initiative. It touches legal, risk, technology, cybersecurity, data governance, and the business itself. The real challenge is connecting all of these functions in a way that allows organizations to make decisions efficiently without compromising trust or accountability. One pattern I've noticed is that organizations often ask, how do we comply with our AI principles? Maybe the better way to think about it is this: how do we build an organization that consistently makes good decisions about AI? Because ultimately, governance isn't about writing better principles. It's about creating an organization that can apply those principles repeatedly, consistently, and at scale.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, principles alone fail because they completely lack the mechanics of execution.
They're just ideas.
Right. A principle like transparency or human oversight requires actual human ownership. It requires explicit decision rights, documentation standards, escalation mechanisms, and, repeatable, scalable processes.
Because it has to survive the real world.
Exactly. Think about what happens in reality. Business objectives demand incredible speed, technical possibilities are pushing boundaries every single week, and regulatory expectations demand extreme caution.
Those are three massive forces colliding.
Right. And when they collide, someone actually has to make a hard decision.
So what does this all mean for the people doing the actual work? To me, it's like having a company motto that says safety first.
Sure.
That's a great principle. Everyone agrees with it. But safety first does not tell the factory worker which exact lever to pull when the machine overheats, right?
No, it doesn't give them an operating manual.
Exactly. You need operational governance that fits naturally into existing business processes. So walk me through a Tuesday morning where these forces actually collide. Like, how does this break down in practice?
Okay, let's look at a concrete example using the EU AI Act's high-risk categories. Let's say your human resources department wants to buy a flashy new SaaS tool that uses AI to scan and sort through thousands of resumes.
Sounds like a pretty standard purchase these days.
Very common. But the law says AI used for recruitment is explicitly high risk, and that requires strict obligations like mandatory risk assessments, proof of high-quality, unbiased data sets, and very detailed logging of how decisions are made.
Okay, so that's a lot of homework.
Right. But inside your company, who actually makes the final binding call on whether this specific new HR tool crosses the legal line into that high-risk category.
That's a great point. Is it HR?
Well, is it the HR department who just wants to hire people faster and, bought the software on a credit card?
Or is it IT, since they have to plug it in?
Exactly. Is it the IT team that has to integrate the API? Or is it the legal team who read the AI Act but honestly probably doesn't understand the underlying machine learning model?
And that right there is the billion-dollar question. If everyone in the company agrees on the high-level principles of fairness and non-discrimination, who actually owns the lever when it comes time to deploy that resume scanner?
Someone has to pull it.
Right. Where does the ultimate responsibility sit? Does it sit with IT, legal, risk, or the business?
Let's hear Nike's perspective on who should own and who should orchestrate AI governance.
I think this is one of those questions that sound simple, but is actually much more nuanced. People often ask which department should own it. I'd probably start somewhere else. If everyone owns AI governance, no one really owns it. On the other hand, if a single department owns it alone, it will almost certainly fail. AI governance is fundamentally cross-functional. Technology understands the models. Legal understands the regulatory landscape. Risk understands the potential impact. Cybersecurity protects the infrastructure. Data governance ensures data quality and ownership. And ultimately, the business owns the decision to deploy AI in the first place. So the real question isn't who owns governance. The real question is who orchestrates governance. That's a very different responsibility. In many organizations, I see governance becoming successful when there is a clearly defined coordination function, whether that's an AI governance lead, an AI office, or another central governance team. Their role isn't to make every decision themselves. Their role is to establish the framework, define responsibilities, coordinate stakeholders, and ensure that decisions are made consistently across the organization. Let me give you an example. I sometimes compare this to an orchestra. The violin doesn't replace the piano. The conductor doesn't play every instrument. But without someone coordinating the performance, you don't get music, you get noise. AI governance works in exactly the same way. Every function brings essential expertise that someone has to connect the pieces into one coherent operating model. That's also why I don't think AI governance officers will primarily become regulatory experts. I believe they become organizational architects. Their real responsibility is designing the structures, decision processes, and accountability models that allow organizations to adopt AI safely, efficiently, and repeatedly. The objective of governance isn't to move decisions to a central AI team. It's to ensure that every decision is taken by the right people at the right time based on the right information. In the end, AI governance isn't about centralizing decisions. It's about making decentralized decisions within a consistent framework.
I really love that concept of orchestration rather than just ownership, because it perfectly highlights the trap so many organizations fall into.
It's so common.
It's the classic corporate dilemma, right? If everybody owns it, nobody actually owns it. But I have to admit, I'm a little confused by the alternative.
How so?
Well, if one single department owns it, say you just dump all AI governance onto the legal department, it fails because lawyers don't have the technical context to evaluate a neural network.
No, you don't.
But if we go with this hybrid model of coordinated responsibility, doesn't that just mean we are forming a massive, slow-moving committee where legal blames tech for not explaining the code and tech blames legal for writing confusing policies and literally nothing gets deployed?
That is absolutely the risk of poorly designed governance, yes. It's the difference between shared responsibility, which, often leads to that finger pointing.
To blame game, yeah.
Right, versus clearly coordinated responsibility. And to be clear, there is no single universally perfect structure for this. Some organizations, particularly in highly regulated sectors like banking, lean toward centralized
Makes
governance.
sense for them.
Others, like decentralized tech conglomerates, are highly federated. But the necessity of cross-functional input, that is absolutely non-negotiable.
You have to have everybody at the table.
You do. Technology teams understand the model's mathematical architecture. Legal understands the nuances of the AI Act and things like the AI Omnibus Amendments.
Wait, pause right there. The AI Omnibus Amendments. For the listener who, maybe isn't steeped in European legislative history, what exactly are we talking about there? Because that sounds like a very dense piece of legal machinery.
Oh, it is, but it's crucial. The AI Omnibus is essentially a package of amendments that updates existing European product safety laws to include AI.
Oh, interesting.
So for decades, Europe has had strict safety laws for physical products, machinery, toys, medical devices. Like if you build a tractor, it has to be safe.
Right, standard safety stuff.
The Omnibus basically says if you put an AI component into that tractor, the AI is now subject to those same rigorous safety and conformity assessments. So your legal team needs to understand how software liability now intersects with physical machinery laws.
Ah, okay. So legal is handling that intersection. Cybersecurity is protecting the data infrastructure from being poisoned. And the business unit ultimately owns the commercial risk and the deployment decision.
Exactly. You need all of them.
So the goal isn't to pull all the decision-making power into one centralized AI committee that bottlenecks the whole company. The goal is to allow for decentralized decisions out on the edges of the company, but within a highly consistent, rigorously coordinated framework.
Exactly the opposite of a slow committee.
Yeah.
You want the edge of the organization to move incredibly fast, but you want them to do it safely on pre-approved tracks.
Right.
And to build those tracks, someone has to actually design the systemic architecture.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Who are the actual human beings taking on this massive orchestration task? We're seeing the rise of entirely new emerging executive roles like job titles that didn't even exist 3 years ago.
Oh yeah, AI governance leads, heads of responsible AI, chief AI officers.
Let's hear Nike on how AI governance leadership roles are likely to evolve.
I'd actually start by saying that I don't think the title is the most important part. Whether organizations call the role an AI governance officer, head of responsible AI, or something entirely different, I believe the expectations will evolve significantly over the next few years. Today, many people still associate these roles primarily with regulatory compliance. I think that's understandable today, but I don't believe that's where the long-term value lies. As organizations adopt more AI systems, someone has to connect business strategy, technology, risk, legal, cybersecurity, data governance, and operational execution. That's not simply a compliance function. It's a leadership function. In my view, AI governance officers won't become the people who approve every AI system. They become the people who design the environment in which good decisions about AI can be made consistently. That includes defining governance frameworks, establishing decision processes, clarifying accountability, creating common standards, and ensuring that governance becomes part of how the organization operates, not an additional layer on top of it. One comparison I often find helpful is with the evolution of the data protection officers. Initially, many organizations viewed them primarily as legal experts. Today, the most successful organizations understand that privacy is closely connected to processes, technology, culture, and business operations. I believe AI governance is following a similar path, but with even greater organizational impact, because AI influences how decisions are made across the entire enterprise. Looking ahead, I think the most successful AI governance leaders won't necessarily be the best lawyers or the best technologists. They'll be translators. They understand regulation well enough to interpret it, technology well enough to ask the right questions, and business well enough to ensure governance supports innovation rather than slowing it down. In other words, they connect disciplines that traditionally worked in separate silos. The future AI governance officer won't be measured by how many AI systems they approve. They'll be measured by how many AI systems the organization can deploy responsibly because the right governance already exists.
The comparison she makes to data protection officers, or DPOs, is really illuminating.
It's a perfect parallel.
Think back to when GDPR first rolled out in Europe. DPOs were largely viewed as just legal experts, basically, like glorified compliance checkers whose only job was to say no to marketing campaigns and manage cookie banners.
Right, they were just the privacy police.
Exactly. But the best DPOs quickly evolved. They became highly operational leaders who fundamentally shaped how their companies handled and monetized data across the globe.
They became strategic.
But I would argue that AI leaders are going to need an even broader reach than that, because AI doesn't just impact data storage, it fundamentally impacts automated decision-making across the entire enterprise supply chain.
They absolutely will need a broader reach. The future AI governance leader is really an organizational architect. They're going to be measured not by how many systems they review or how many audits they pass, but by how many systems they actually enable the organization to deploy responsibly and at scale.
They're enablers, not just blockers.
Right. They have to connect regulation, technology, risk, data privacy, cybersecurity, and overarching business strategy. They are, at their core, translators.
They have to connect the deeply entrenched silos of a modern corporation.
Exactly.
They literally have to speak lawyer to the lawyers, Python to the software engineers, and ROI to the board of directors.
Which is a rare skill set.
It really is. But let's get real for a second. If this cross-functional orchestration is what the ideal future looks like, where are companies falling flat on their faces right now?
Oh, everywhere.
Right. As organizations scramble to comply with the AI Act and implement frameworks like the NIST RMF, what are the recurring, painful implementation gaps you're seeing on the ground?
This raises an important question because the gaps are usually found in how organizations treat the life cycle of the technology. Let's hear which governance gaps Nike sees emerging most frequently.
If I had to point to one recurring pattern, it would be this. The biggest implementation gap isn't technical. Most organizations already have access to excellent models, cloud platforms, and AI tools. Technology is advancing incredibly fast. What doesn't evolve at the same pace are organizations themselves. In many projects, I see a strong focus on the technical implementation. Teams discuss model performance, infrastructure, prompts, or architecture. But surprisingly little attention is given to the organizational questions that determine whether AI can actually be deployed successfully over time. Who is responsible once the system is live? How are changes documented? What happens when the model is updated? How do you ensure that risk assessments remain valid over time? Who monitors whether the system still behaves as intended? Those questions often emerge very late in the process. Something else I've noticed quite often is that organizations frequently treat every AI project as an isolated initiative. Every project defines its own governance. Every project creates its own documentation. Every project establishes its own approval process. That might work for the first AI use case. It doesn't work when an organization has 50. So for me, that's really the key takeaway. I believe organizations should stop thinking about governing individual AI systems and start thinking about building governance capabilities. Capabilities that every future AI project can build upon. Standardized decision processes, standardized documentation, clear ownership, reusable governance patterns, because that's ultimately what enables scale. One lesson I've learned is that governance should never be something you add at the end of a project. Governance should be part of the architecture from day one, not because regulation requires it, but because organizations that build governance into their operating model will be able to deploy new AI use cases faster, more consistently, and with greater confidence. In the end, the organizations that succeed won't necessarily have the smartest AI. They have the strongest organizational capability to deploy AI repeatedly and responsibly. I actually think we're in a unique moment. Organizations don't have hundreds of productive AI systems yet. That gives us the opportunity to build governance while AI is still scaling, not after it has already become unmanageable. In hindsight, that may turn out to be one of the biggest advantages organizations have today.
The danger of treating every AI project as an isolated, bespoke initiative. I mean, it simply cannot be overstated.
It's a huge trap.
If every single project team defines its own governance rules, creates its own custom Word document for risk logging, and establishes its own unique approval process, you might survive the first project.
Sure.
You might even survive the fifth. But that completely breaks down at project number 50.
Right. It's completely unscalable. It's what you might call artisanal governance.
Artisanal governance, exactly.
Just handcrafted compliance for every single model.
Yes. And artisanal governance actively conflicts with the lifecycle monitoring requirements found in these major regulatory frameworks.
Because you can't track it all.
Right. Both the NIST AI RMF and the EU AI Act heavily emphasize post-market monitoring. It's not just about getting a stamp of approval on launch day.
Right. AI isn't static.
Think about how machine learning works. A model is trained on historical data, but the real world changes. If you train a supply chain AI on data from the summer and suddenly a massive winter storm hits, the model's predictions might start drifting wildly off course.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great point.
How do you ensure your initial risk assessments remain valid 6 months later when the model has been exposed to new shifting real-world data? How are algorithm updates documented? If every project is governed differently, enterprise-wide lifecycle monitoring is essentially impossible.
This brings us to a concept we should really highlight: governance by design. It's about building reusable enterprise-wide governance capabilities rather than starting from scratch every single time an engineer has a new idea.
Build it once, use it everywhere.
Exactly. You build the tracks once, and then you can run 100 trains on them. And frankly, there is a massive silver lining here for you, the listener, because most organizations don't actually have hundreds of generative AI systems in production yet. They're mostly still running proofs of concept and early scaling phases. There is a unique window of opportunity right now.
A very brief window.
Right. Companies can build these governance architectures today before the scale becomes completely unmanageable.
It is significantly easier to build a solid foundation before the skyscraper is fully constructed and occupied.
Yeah, try retrofitting a skyscraper. It doesn't go well.
Exactly. And it is crucial to recognize that this isn't just a European challenge, even though Europe is aggressively leading the legislative charge with the AI Act.
Right, which brings us to the global perspective. With the AI Act setting an incredibly high, stringent bar, and tools like the AI Omnibus extending compliance timelines for certain high-risk systems all the way out to, 2027 and 2028.
Something like that, yeah.
What does this actually mean for the rest of the world? For organizations sitting in North America, Africa, or Asia who might think, well, I don't operate in Berlin, so why should I care?
Here is Nike's advice for organizations outside Europe that are beginning to build AI governance frameworks.
I'd probably summarize it like this. The most important lesson from Europe isn't the regulation itself. It's what the regulation is forcing organizations to do. Many discussions about the AI Act focus on compliance. If we take a step back for a moment, the regulation is encouraging organizations to ask questions they probably should have asked anyway. Who is accountable? Which data are we using? How do we validate AI systems? How do we monitor them over time? How do we document important decisions? Those aren't just regulatory questions, they're management questions. And I think that's an important distinction, because the organizations that answer these questions well won't just become more compliant, they'll become better at deploying AI consistently across the enterprise. Looking beyond Europe, I don't believe every country will adopt the AI Act. But I do believe every organization that wants to scale AI will eventually face very similar operational challenges. Governance, accountability, transparency, and risk management are not uniquely European concepts. their fundamental capabilities for managing AI responsibly. So, from my perspective, the real opportunity for Europe isn't to export regulation. It's to export practical experience, to show what works and what doesn't, how governance can be embedded into existing organizations, and how companies can move from individual AI experiments to enterprise-wide adoption. And that's where I really see Europe's opportunity. It can lead in operational AI governance, not because Europe has all the answers today, but because organizations here are among the first to build these capabilities in practice. And ultimately, I think that's what the rest of the world will be most interested in. Not how Europe wrote the regulation, but how organizations turned that regulation into real operational capability. I don't think the future competitive advantage in AI will come from having access to better models. I think, again, it will come from building organizations that can adopt AI repeatedly, responsible, and at scale.
So if we look at the core themes we've explored today, the most prominent takeaway, the thing you should be taking back to your executive team tomorrow, is that regulation merely starts the work. It absolutely does not complete it.
It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. The EU AI Act is, at its core, forcing essential management questions. It is forcing organizations to ask hard questions about accountability, about where their data is sourced, and about lifecycle monitoring.
Which they should have been doing anyway.
Frankly, yes, these are questions that well-run organizations should have been asking themselves about their technology anyway.
And while having high-level AI principles like transparency and fairness is a great starting point for your corporate culture, they are essentially hollow marketing phrases unless you back them up with rigorous operating models and repeatable, scalable processes.
They need teeth.
Exactly. You need the mechanics of execution. You need to know who pulls the lever when the machine overheats.
Furthermore, that execution cannot happen in an isolated silo. Governance must be highly cross-functional. It requires input from legal, tech, cybersecurity, and the business units, but it must be clearly and decisively coordinated.
Orchestrated, as we said earlier.
Yes, this massive need is giving rise to a new breed of AI governance leaders who act as organizational architects and, frankly, multilingual translators across the enterprise.
Ultimately, organizations have to stop treating AI governance like a bespoke project-by-project compliance hurdle. You have to stop doing artisanal governance.
Please stop.
They need to build reusable governance capabilities that allow the edge of the business to innovate rapidly, but within a safe framework.
And perhaps the most interesting global takeaway here is that Europe's most valuable contribution to the world might not actually be the legal text of the regulation itself.
Really? What do you think it is then?
It may very well be the practical implementation experience. By moving first and forcing the issue, European organizations are becoming the global testing ground for what actually works operationally when you try to govern AI at scale.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. And that brings us to the end of our analysis for today. But before we go, we always like to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you look at your own organization's strategy.
Think about this. If the future competitive advantage in artificial intelligence doesn't come from having the absolute best, most cutting-edge models, because, those models will eventually become commoditized.
They already are in some ways.
Right. But rather from having the best organizational capability to deploy those models safely and rapidly at scale, is your organization currently investing more of its time and money in its algorithms or in its architecture?
Wow, that's a great question to end on. A huge thank you to Nike Diedrich for contributing her fantastic insights to our inaugural Neural Flow expert briefing. Listening to AI Governance, Strategy and the Future of Intelligent Organizations. Remember, you can have the most beautiful blueprint for a suspension bridge in the world, but if you haven't figured out how to pour the concrete underwater, you're not getting to the other side. Until next time, keep diving deep.